The rise and fall of the Roman Republic is one of history's greatest ironies. In its infancy, Rome was just one of many small city states dominated by tyrants and despots. But in 509 BC, they drove off their last king, a particularly nasty tyrant known as Tarquin the Proud. Through a mix of genius, foresight, and past trauma, both the upper and lower classes of Rome vowed to never again let one man rule. They carefully set up an intricate republican system featuring a senate, democratically elected assemblies, executive leaders with term limits, and systems of checks and balances that were revolutionary for the time. The system was a beacon of freedom in a very unfree world. That stability and efficiency transformed Rome from an Italian backwater into the dominant power of the Mediterranean. It worked brilliantly until, well, it didn't. The great irony is that this global superpower, whose entire identity and success was based on anti authoritarianism, was forced to revert back to authoritarianism to save itself from collapse. In fact, Rome's return to authoritarianism did more than save it from collapse. It paved the way forward to even greater heights of prosperity, peace, and glory. This is the story of how authoritarianism saved Rome. This is history worth knowing. Part 1: The Republic's Fatal Flaws. The Roman Republic was a victim of its own success. Over hundreds of years, the Roman war machine gradually expanded its borders through the conquest and subjugation of its rivals across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Foreign conquest brought immense wealth and power to the Republic, but it also sowed the seeds of its downfall. Much of the conquered territory was turned into agri publicus, or public land, owned by the state to be distributed amongst the middle-class citizen farmers who made up the backbone of Roman society. But in practice, it didn't happen this way. Wealthy, well-connected elites used loopholes and outright theft to gobble up large tracts of land for themselves. They consolidated this land into vast estates called latifundia, which they worked with captured foreign slaves. As land and slaves concentrated in elite hands, wealth inequality exploded and Rome's middle class crumbled. This issue led to what would be the first domino to fall in the death of the Republic: land reform. Tiberius Gracchus was elected as tribune of the plebs on the promise of redistributing land to poor Roman citizens. This, of course, was fiercely opposed by Rome's elite, and in 133 BC he was assassinated by a violent mob. This act of violence was more significant than it sounds because it was the first politically motivated killing in the Republic's history. Tiberius's death set a precedent for the political violence that exploded in the final decades of the Republic. The next domino to fall would be a drastic change to the Roman military brought about by a general named Gaius Marius. Known as the Marian Reforms, this allowed poor, landless Roman citizens to join the military and become professional career soldiers. Prior to this, only landowning citizens who could afford to furnish their own equipment could join the military. They would be called for service as needed and then returned to work their land. These new landless career soldiers no longer had a stake in the system. They became economically dependent not on the Roman Republic as a whole, but on their individual commanders whose fortune they were tied to. Roman generals like Sulla, Marius, Pompey, and Caesar exploited this dependency to create their own personal power bases, lavishly rewarding their soldiers with the spoils of conquest and land upon retirement. This new dynamic came to a head in 88 BC when Sulla, after losing command of Rome's eastern campaign to his political rival Marius, convinced his soldiers to march on Rome. Once in Rome, Sulla began purging his rivals, killing many of them and confiscating their property. It was the first civil war in Rome's history, and the first time a Roman army was used against Rome itself. Another dangerous precedent was set. Roman generals could leverage armies loyal to themselves to destroy rivals and advance their own ambitions whenever things didn't go their way. Part 2: The Death Spiral. Rome at this point was no longer a homogeneous society, with an estimated 30 to 40% of the population being foreign slaves. The influx of foreign slaves had destroyed the value of labor. The citizen farmers who had previously been the backbone of the Republic drifted into urban centers like Rome itself, whose population had exploded. There they struggled with unemployment and depended on handouts from the state, creating a volatile political element ripe for exploitation by populist leaders. Rome's massive slave population also led to domestic rebellions, which distracted leaders and sucked up valuable resources. The most famous example of this was a slave revolt led by a gladiator named Spartacus in 73 BC. Spartacus led 70 other gladiators in an armed revolt against their masters. Within months, tens of thousands joined them. For 2 years, Spartacus's army rampaged across Italy, defeating Roman forces and humiliating the Senate. The Senate was forced to give Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, unprecedented power and authority to smash the rebellion. Spartacus and his slave army were defeated, but the event was yet another sign of the Republic's decline. For one, it proved how dangerously reliant Rome was on foreign slaves. And two, it set a precedent for ambitious men breaking constitutional traditions to elevate themselves during times of crisis. By this time, the Senate was growing deeply jealous of men like Crassus and anxious of the growing influence they had over the Republic. But the Senate's hands were hardly clean at this time. The Senate was no longer a body of altruistic nobles governing on principle. It had become an enormous graft machine powered by bribery, patronage, vote buying, intimidation, and naked self interest. The final years of the Republic were defined by the struggle between the entrenched senatorial elite and upstart populist demagogues like Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. With both sides corrupt to the bone and ruthlessly pursuing their own self interest over the common good, things were about to come to a head. In 60 BC, Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey joined forces against the Senate in an informal alliance that would become known as the First Triumvirate. The three men pooled their wealth, power, and influence to circumvent the Senate, who they saw as trying to sabotage their ambitions. When the Senate ordered him to give up command of his legions in Gaul in 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched his army on Rome, driving his now rival Pompey from the city and putting the Senate on notice. Caesar spent the next several years chasing and defeating his enemies around the Mediterranean. After declaring himself dictator for life, he was stabbed to death by a group of senators in 44 BC. These senators believed they were making one final attempt to save the Republic. One of them, Brutus, could even trace his ancestry back to the nobles who had overthrown the last Roman monarch, King Tarquin. But the reality was that by this point, the Republic these senators thought they were saving was functionally dead. The Roman Republic, grown fat, complacent, and corrupt through its own success, began to implode like a massive star crushed by its own gravitational weight. Part 3. The People Crave a King. Caesar's death left Rome with an existential void. It was clear the Republic had died, but there was no framework for what would come next. Caesar's nephew, named heir Octavian, would have to fight a Darwinian struggle against both his uncle's rivals and allies. 17 years later, Octavian stood alone as Caesar's heir. After 10 civil wars in just 60 years, Rome was exhausted. The chaos had to end. It was clear to everyone there was just one solution. One man must rule. The Senate, having been unwilling to submit to Caesar's authoritarian ambitions, were now practically begging Octavian to assume one-man rule. They showered him with titles like Princeps, Imperator, and the one that endured, Augustus. While these titles effectively gave Augustus all the powers of a king, he was careful not to appear as one. Augustus was smart. He saw how Caesar's unashamed desire to be a king got him killed, and he understood Rome's historical hatred of kings. The genius of Augustus was that he made becoming an emperor look like a restoration of the Republic. He ceremoniously returned power to the Senate and other traditional offices while quietly pulling the real strings of power himself behind the curtain. Unlike the demagogues of the late Republic who clamored over each other to display their wealth and status, Augustus lived and dressed moderately. He banned crowns, royal robes, and even the title of king. Instead of spending state funds on vanity projects, he invested in public works like roads, aqueducts, theaters, and temples. Augustus centralized control and funding of the military, ensuring legions would again be loyal to the state rather than independent strongmen. He stabilized the Roman economy with a standardized currency system. By instituting a census, he completely reorganized the taxation system to stamp out abuse and corruption. No longer would taxation be arbitrarily forced on Rome's subjects for the benefit of political factions or private individuals. But what's arguably most striking about the reforms of Augustus was that they went much further than the external organization of political and civic life. They reached deeply into the Roman psyche. Augustus believed the root cause of the last 100+ years of chaos was moral degeneration. The endless civil wars were more than a political failure. They were the result of greed, decadence, selfishness, and the abandonment of traditional family and religious values. Augustus instituted sweeping moral reforms known as the Julian laws. These laws rewarded Romans for marrying and having children and penalized the unmarried and childless. They also made adultery a public crime with serious consequences. In order to combat greed and decadence, Augustus instituted sumptuary laws that limited spending on banquets and clothing, the display of gold and jewelry, and even the number of guests at a feast. After decades of extravagance, the core Roman virtues of moderation and simplicity were reinstated. Part 4. The Golden Era. Augustus died peacefully in 14 AD after a reign of 41 years. What came after would become his greatest legacy. 2 centuries of peace and prosperity. Known today as the Pax Romana, the 200 years following its transition from republic to empire was Rome's golden age. The empire reached its territorial zenith and was connected by roads and shipping lanes, allowing the economy to flourish like never before. Citizenship was expanded, and newly conquered regions who submitted shared in the prosperity. Improved sanitation and public health infrastructure, along with a more varied and stable food supply, led to a peak in overall health. By every measure, prosperity, stability, even average height, the Pax Romana marked the peak in living standards of the ancient world. Had it not surrendered its republican ideals, would Rome have enjoyed this golden era? Would there even have been a Rome at all? From civil war to stability, from chaos to order, authoritarianism, for all its flaws, had done what democracy could not. Rome's return to authoritarianism didn't just save it from collapse. It created one of the most enduring and influential civilizations of all time. The lesson from this is that nothing is absolute. A political system that works today might not work tomorrow. A society that stops evolving is living on borrowed time. What do you think? Did authoritarianism save Rome? What lessons can modern society learn from this? Let me know in the comments.